Okay, so I was facilitating workshop D, which was to do with standards, which standards are out there and why they matter. And my name's Anna Clements. I'm Assistant Director of Library Services at the University of St Andrews, and I was very ably helped by Valerie McCutcheon from the University of Glasgow and also Tony O'Rourke. Tony was going to be our scribe, but as is the case of these things, he actually spent most of his time taking photographs, and you'll see a lot of the photographs as I just go through this summary. So from my background, I'm very interested in standards in order to improve workflows and processes wherever they are. I used to be in IT, I moved to the library, and I'm interested in how standards can be developed collaboratively. And obviously, working in the area I do in the library, it's useful to understand the publisher processes and the intermediate processes as well, to see where we can either use existing standards or where there are gaps we can identify. So we had a great group of people, a very interactive group of people in the workshop. They even cheered yesterday when they thought at the thought of having come back again today to carry on the work. So I've never heard that before. That was fantastic. Anyway, we started in the traditional way, just trying to identify what standards we were aware of as a group. It was a mixed group, so there were, I think, slightly more publishers than others, but there were librarians as well, and technical people and other standards people and so on. So we did this with post-its. So this is just obviously a pitch to show how we were looking at the post-its and identifying. Will it move on? Yeah. So once we'd identified the standards, we did some sort of simple hand shows to see who had heard of these standards. And I've just picked out one of the categories we looked at, which was identifiers, which obviously came up. We did also look at definitions, or lists, taxonomies, data models, policies, and others. But if you look at the identifiers, then it's obvious to see that everybody has heard of ORCID. Most people are doing something with ORCID. If you look at things like organisational identifiers, then there are several players in the area, and there's no sort of consensus of which one should be used, so that's maybe something that needs to be worked on. And also, interestingly, we looked at other identifiers for people like Researcher ID, and it looks like nobody's using Researcher ID in the room anymore. They're all using ORCID, so that's quite interesting. And the other idea, of course, that came up was funder reference as well. So what we then did, which was obviously quite a challenge, was to try and simplify the main step, the article publishing processing, right down to its basics, its basic blocks, to separate out into groups, to identify, if you like, the pain points in the processes, particularly around the exchange of information between different parties. So we looked at the submission process, we looked at the review process, we looked at the publishing process, and obviously there's payment in there somewhere, and the payment we actually concentrated on was APCs, because we were talking about article publishing. So I'll just go through quickly some of the main issues that came out. What we tried to do was look at the issues and then try and concentrate and prioritise on some issues where we thought we could actually make some recommendations. So in the submission process, then the obvious thing there is that everybody does it differently, or they seem to do it differently. So there must be some role somewhere for a working group of the stakeholders to try and harmonise the submission process. Whether that's not necessarily just to determine the actual pieces of information that should be collected and the infrastructure that should be tied in, like ORCID, Crossref, and so on, but also perhaps in terms of the actual basic process as well, and so on. So that was one key thing that came out. So that's, if you like, a call to arms to see if that is something that could be taken up and who would take that up. I myself am aware, and I work with CASRI, but whether CASRI is the right group to take that up or whether it's through STM or some other group, I don't know. But it needs to be a cross-stakeholder group, I think. The other area was to do with review, the review process, and I think here, this came out actually repeatedly, we have ORCID, we have some other pieces of infrastructure already, but these are only being used around the margins, I would say, so there's obviously a lot to be done in trying to adopt these more and to use them for more use cases. And one obvious one is for reviewers to have to have an ORCID, so partly to maybe build up a register of reviewers, but also to be able to certify that reviewers are who they say they are, and so on. So that's a fairly simple thing, one would think, but that's something that maybe should be borne in mind. The other side, and I was interested in what, was it Rick Anderson or the other Anderson was saying this morning, I could get confused, we're saying about publishers training reviewers. That's great to hear. I don't know if all publishers do that, and if there are standards against which reviewers are trained, because I'm sure we in the research organisations would be great to know if there were and what those standards were, and encourage our staff as well to go on those such courses. And the final thing was to do with the publish. Oh no, I've got two more, so I'll go quickly. So the publish section was to do with version controls and DOIs as early as possible. We have DOIs and acceptance in some places, right? Well, we should be pushing it right back, so when the object's created, preprints, etc., etc. There's the issue about licenses, and there's the issue about automating deposit in PubMed. This is all, again, to do with the fact that if we know the funder, we know the policy, we know the license we should be using, so it's joining these pieces together. And finally, this was around the APC payments, and the big thing that I think research organisations are crying out for is to ensure that there are standard guidelines for what should be on an invoice. And I think that's a really ripe opportunity for the right group of people to actually come up with what are the really critical pieces of information that should be on an invoice for an APC, and you can see them listed there. So there are some concrete things I think that we should think about and try and get moving. And thank you again to all the people who were in that workshop.